The person or nation that restores order is dad. That's who's in charge. That's the head of household. That's the head of the world. So by force, if necessary, you could certainly make a regime change argument about Canada. Talk about a country that's oppressing its own citizens, killed almost 100,000 of them. Canada's not a sovereign country. It never has been, ever. It's part of the British Commonwealth. Now it's some sort of colony of India and China. What's happening in Iran is the end of American empire as we understand it. And that's sad. Boo-hoo. Empire's dying. Straits of Hormuz. The President of the United States said that last night. Someone else do it. So we're done. That's okay.
Look, I know what you're thinking when you see Tucker Carlson's name, but hold on a second. Because what he's about to lay out here is actually one of the most important conversations nobody in mainstream media wants to have. We're talking about the literal end of American empire as we know it, and what comes next. And here's the thing, he's not wrong about a lot of this. The unipolar moment is over. The question is, what do we do about it? Do we keep pretending we can police the entire planet while our own infrastructure crumbles and people can't afford insulin? Or do we actually focus on our own hemisphere, our own people, and build something sustainable? Watch what happens here. Because Tucker's about to say some things that are going to make the defense contractors and the DC establishment lose their minds. Let's get into it.
The person or nation that restores order is dad. That's who's in charge. That's the head of household. That's the head of the world. So that's what's at stake. Who runs the world? Now, is this good or bad from an American perspective? Well, that's a more complicated question. Short term, of course, it's bad. There's a humiliation coming at some point. You hope it's not too profound. You hope it's not, 10 times worse than the fall of Saigon in 1975 or the retreat from Kabul just a few years ago. You hope not, because it's dispiriting and people will die and it's just awful in every way. But at some point, it will become clear that the United States couldn't do the thing that great powers do, which is keep commerce going. And so it doesn't mean the United States is not a great power. It just means it's not as great as maybe some people imagined it was. It's not as powerful as our leaders told us it was, and in some cases actually thought it was. And what that really means is the unipolar moment is over. Now, it's been over for a while, but in the minds of your average U.S. senator from Nebraska, we're in charge of everything and everyone will just bow to our terms. And that's not true, hasn't been true for at least 15 years. It's definitely not true now. And no one will be able to deny it. So that's going to be hard for some people to accept. It could be dispiriting to us as a nation, but it reflects reality and it's not the end of American power or prosperity. It might, in fact, be the beginning of actual power and more durable prosperity, the kind rooted in resources and production, the kind that's not necessarily dependent on finance. So it doesn't need to be a disaster, but it's definitely going to be a global reshuffling. And it revolves around the question of resources. It revolves around what President Trump, to his credit, understands, which is ultimately power derives from prosperity. Rich countries are powerful. Rich countries get to build powerful militaries to express and, in rare occasions, exert their power. But wealth comes from resources. And what are resources? Resources are food, water, and energy. The three things necessary for life, for growth, for civilization. Food, water, energy. Food, by and large, comes from energy, by the way. Huge percentage of fertilizer comes from natural gas, but it takes energy to make food, of course. But a country's resources, its physical resources, the things it finds in the ground, are essential to that country's prosperity. So physical reality matters, and that's harder and harder to keep in mind when our day-to-day realities are determined by things that are not real, electrical impulses, ones and zeros, the digital world. But the digital world has limits, and those limits arrive at, say, lunchtime when you're hungry. You can't eat Instagram. You have to eat food, and that's produced by people grown in the ground, watered with water. So physical reality intrudes, and Trump, because he is in the best way, at his best, a primitive person, understands the primitive reality, which is we need these things. So if you look at the world that way, what are the rich countries? What are the rich hemispheres? Well, again, Asia has, relatively speaking, very little energy. A lot of highly productive countries, starting with Japan and China, are totally dependent on other countries for resources. And of course, if you paid any attention to what happened in the last century, you know, Imperial Japan became imperial because it didn't have enough resources. And that's why it went into China, and that's why it invaded a bunch of its neighbors, and that's how we wound up in a war with it. So this question doesn't go away.
Okay, so I got to pause this right here because Tucker just made a point that nobody in Washington wants to acknowledge. And it's so obvious, it hurts. Wealth comes from actual physical resources, food, water, energy, not financial instruments, not derivatives, not whatever crypto scheme your nephew's trying to get you into. Actual stuff, stuff you can touch, stuff you need to survive. And this is where it gets wild, right? Because for the past 40 years, we've been told that we live in a service economy now, that manufacturing doesn't matter, that we can just financialize everything and print money and it'll all work out. Meanwhile, China's been buying up rare earth minerals and building factories and cornering the global supply chain. And we've been, what, building another hedge fund? Creating another streaming service nobody asked for? Like, dude, the man is absolutely right about this. The digital world has limits. You can't eat Instagram. You can't heat your house with a Netflix subscription. At some point, physical reality intrudes. And we've been living in this fantasy where we think we can just move money around on spreadsheets and call ourselves powerful, while our own manufacturing base gets gutted and shipped overseas. And here's the thing that drives me crazy. The people who engineered this, the politicians who signed NAFTA, who gave China most favored nation status, who let corporations offshore everything, they got rich. Their donor class got insanely, obscenely rich. But the working class, the people who used to have factory jobs with pensions, they got decimated. Entire towns got hollowed out. And now we're supposed to act surprised that China has leverage over us? That we're dependent on them for critical supplies? Follow the money. It always comes back to the money. The same billionaires who lobbied for outsourcing are the ones who now own the media telling you that economic nationalism is dangerous or isolationist. They don't want you thinking about this stuff. They want you fighting about bathrooms and pronouns and whatever culture war distraction keeps you from noticing that they sold your country's industrial capacity for quarterly earnings reports. Tucker's talking about resources determining power, and he's not wrong. But let's be clear about who gave away those resources, who signed those trade deals. It wasn't working people. It was corporate captured politicians on both sides, Democrats and Republicans alike. They all cashed the checks. I know you guys don't need me to explain that to you. You've watched your local Walmart replace the downtown that your grandparents built. You've seen what happens when everything gets financialized and nothing gets made anymore. Let me know in the comments though, do you think we can actually reverse this? Or is the manufacturing base just gone forever? Because that's the real question going forward.
The world through that lens, you see that we're in a pretty good spot. Because the United States, as the president never tires of saying, has deep resources. Land, water, and lots of energy. Now, on the specific question of oil, it's a little bit more complicated than you have heard. The U.S. does actually import quite a bit of oil. What we have is a massive abundance of natural gas, which 25 years ago was considered kind of marginally significant. Now it's understood to be a critical resource from which all kinds of different products that you use every day and pharmaceuticals and, as noted, fertilizer and electricity all come. The United States has huge reserves of natural gas. But our region, North America, South America, the Caribbean, the Western Hemisphere, has massive reserves of energy, has huge amounts of water, fresh water, which matters, and has the world's best farmland. So we are in a very rich hemisphere, and we haven't really internalized that. So actually, if the world cleaves in two, if China fully controls the East, or mostly controls the East, and we mostly control the West, probably something we could live with. Probably not a terrible thing for the United States, but it would require a totally different way of thinking. It would require the U.S. government, the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, all the academics that feeded information and deep thoughts about what the empire should be. It would require all of them to change the way they think about the United States and its place in the world. So all of a sudden, what happens in Brazil, which has massive reserves of freshwater, farmland, and energy, would be way more important than what happens in Saudi Arabia. And that's not a bad thing, because we have a lot in common with Brazil. It's a Christian country with a Romance language in our hemisphere, right there, directly beneath us. It's a country almost the size of the continental United States. It's a huge country. It's a beautiful country, by the way. And Saudi Arabia is on the other side of the world. So why wouldn't you spend a lot more time thinking about what happens in Brazil, trying to improve Brazil, make it more stable, make it more pro-American, not roll in and steal its oil, its resources, but bring it into your sphere of influence? Well, a country that was thinking clearly would do that and would have been doing that for like the past 200 years. And not just in a Marshall Monroe Doctrine way, we're not going to tolerate this, tolerate that, but actually try to integrate your economies a little bit more. Again, have positive influence, some sway over Brazil. And then you think, well, if Brazil's important, what about Canada and Mexico, which are literally on our borders, which are huge energy producers? Canada has far more oil than the United States, far more fresh water than the United States. Canada is the fourth biggest oil reserves in the world. How much do Americans know about Canada? Well, Canada happens to be falling apart as a nation, completely falling apart. It's in a state of domestic chaos. It's become a police state under the influence of China. Canada, the country with which we share the longest border. Our most critical ally on the globe is Canada, the country we ignore. How many Americans know what its capital is or how to pronounce it? Probably under half. Canada is the single most important relationship that we have. It has always been our largest trading partner. But going forward, as American influence recedes to our hemisphere, what happens in Canada matters more than anything else. Maybe we should think about that.
Hold on. We got to talk about what he just said about Canada, because this is actually insane and nobody's covering it. Canada is falling apart. And I don't mean that as hyperbole. I mean literally falling apart. Trudeau turned it into a surveillance state during the trucker protests. They froze people's bank accounts for donating to a protest. Think about that. The government just decided you supported the wrong cause, so they locked you out of your own money. That's not democracy. That's authoritarian nightmare fuel. And the MAID program he mentioned, Canada's state-sponsored euthanasia program, it's genuinely horrifying. They're now offering assisted suicide to poor people, to disabled people, to veterans with PTSD. Like, instead of giving people healthcare or mental health support or housing, they're just like, hey, have you considered dying about it? It's dystopian. It's eugenics with a progressive PR campaign. But here's what's wild, and Tucker touched on this but didn't fully go there. Canada is effectively a client state now, not of the US, of China. Chinese money has completely infiltrated Canadian politics, Canadian real estate, Canadian infrastructure. There's massive Chinese influence operations happening in Canadian elections, and the government just lets it happen. Trudeau's government has done basically nothing to counter it. And this matters for us. This isn't just, oh, Canada's got some problems. This is our longest border, our largest trading partner, a country that shares NORAD with us, a country that's supposed to be our closest ally, and it's being hollowed out by foreign influence while its government oppresses its own citizens. Now look, Tucker's framing here gets a little Tuckery when he starts talking about regime change and invasion. I'm not trying to co-sign military intervention in Canada. That's crazy talk. But is he wrong that we should be paying way more attention to what's happening there? That we should maybe have a foreign policy that prioritizes our actual neighbors over countries on the other side of the planet? Like, we've spent trillions in the Middle East over the past 20 years. Trillions. Blood and treasure poured into Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen. And for what? What did we get? Did any of that make your life better? Did it make you safer? Did it lower your gas prices? No. It made defense contractors rich. It made oil executives rich. It made the politicians who took their money rich. But it gutted our own country. Meanwhile, Canada, the country we share a massive border with, is in chaos, and we're just not paying attention. Mexico is run by cartels who have more power than the actual government, and fentanyl is flooding across the border, killing 100,000 Americans a year. But sure, let's keep worrying about what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. That makes sense. This is what Tucker's getting at with the whole America needs to focus on its own hemisphere thing. And honestly, he's not wrong. Not because of nationalism or isolationism or whatever scared label people want to slap on it, but because we literally cannot afford to keep doing what we've been doing. We're $35 trillion in debt. Our infrastructure is crumbling. People are rationing insulin, and we're still trying to be the world's policeman? It's not sustainable. It never was. And the people who sold you on it knew that. They just didn't care because they got rich off the contracts. Let me know in the comments, do you think focusing on North America instead of the Middle East is isolationist? Or is it just common sense at this point?
Try to exert some influence on Canada, not necessarily by force, though by force if necessary. You could certainly make a regime change argument about Canada. Talk about a country that's oppressing its own citizens, killed almost 100,000 of them through its state-sponsored killing program, MAIDs. You could make a human rights case to invade Canada, not that we should. But if ever there was a people that needed liberation from a government that hates them, it's the Canadians, of course. But you could make a case based on self-interest and regional interest, even on decency, to have a lot more positive influence on the internal affairs of Canada than we currently do. Canada's not a sovereign country. It never has been, ever. It's part of the British Commonwealth. Now it's some sort of colony of India and China. It's never been sovereign, and there's no reason that it should be. It should be decent and well run for the benefit of its own citizens. And you could say the same for Mexico. Mexico has brought benefits to the United States. A lot of decent people have come from Mexico. There's a lot of American manufacturing in Mexico, a lot of great vacation spots in Mexico, a lot of great Mexicans. But overall, Mexico has been a massive problem for the United States, both because of mass migration from Mexico, because of the ongoing drug war in Mexico, which has now moved into the United States. There's massive cartel influence in the United States. There are politicians in the United States taking money from the cartels. America is, with every passing day, becoming more like Mexico, and not in a good way. Mexico has harmed the United States in a lot of ways, real ways, measurable ways. The migrant crisis, all those illegals Biden let in, they all mostly came through Mexico. With the knowledge, in some cases, the cooperation of the Mexican government. That's the behavior of an enemy nation. They don't need to be an enemy. But fixing that will require paying some attention to what happens in Mexico. That's not bad. That's good. That'll be good for Mexico. And it's necessary for the United States. So why is all this relevant now? Because what's happening in Iran is the end of American empire as we understand it. And that's sad. Boo-hoo. Empire's dying. But it's not the end of the United States. It's not the end of our influence on other nations, hopefully positive influence. It's not the end of our economy. It's the beginning of a very rough time in our economy, of course. But it's hardly the end of it. What we've been doing for likely your lifetime, if you're under 80, is, well, it's not working anymore. It hasn't actually helped the United States long term. Your grandkids at this point don't have the promise of a better life than you had. So it's not actually a successful experiment. And now it's ending because we've reached the limits of our demonstrated power. We can't open the Straits of Hormuz. The President of the United States said that last night. Someone else do it. So we're done. That's okay. It was always going to end. Hopefully we can get out without a nuclear exchange. But now it is ending. And there's going to be a lot of suffering and sadness as a result of that end, but there is an awful lot of promise. Promise that the United States can act in its own interest, that it can be reasonable, that it will not be governed by deranged people seized by hubris or get way out over their skis and get a ton of people killed. You don't have to occupy countries you've never been to, can't identify on a map. I mean, what we're doing doesn't work, whether you approve of it morally or not. And we're going to do something else. And that something else is starting right now. So the only point is, you could, with wise leadership, turn this to the advantage of the United States and the Western Hemisphere.
All right, so look, here's my final take on this. Tucker Carlson just laid out something that most mainstream commentators are too scared to say out loud. The American empire, as we've known it for the past 70 plus years, is over. Not because America is weak, not because we're in decline, but because the model we've been running, global military dominance, endless wars, propping up puppet governments, trade deals that gutted our manufacturing, it doesn't work anymore. It hasn't worked for a long time. And the people who benefited from that model, the defense contractors, the oil companies, the politicians on both sides who took their money, they don't want you to realize it's over. They want to keep the gravy train going as long as possible. But it's done. We can't open the Strait of Hormuz. The president said it himself. Someone else is going to have to do it. Now, Tucker's solution here, focus on the Western Hemisphere, pay attention to Canada and Mexico and Brazil, prioritize actual resources over financial games. That's not crazy. That's actually pretty reasonable. The problem is, the people in power right now have no intention of doing that, because it would require them to admit they were wrong. It would require them to stop cashing checks from the military-industrial complex, and they're not going to do that voluntarily. But here's the thing. This shift is happening, whether they like it or not. The question is, do we manage it intelligently, or do we flail around pretending we're still the lone superpower while everything falls apart? Do we invest in our own people, our own infrastructure, our own hemisphere? Or do we keep sending trillions overseas while Americans can't afford rent? I know where I stand, and I think you do too. So here's what I need from you. Like this video, share it, drop a comment with your thoughts. Do you think Tucker's right about refocusing on North America? Do you think the empire's actually over, or can we keep it going? Let me know. And if you're not already subscribed to MB, hit that button, because this is the kind of conversation nobody else is having. The kind that makes both the establishment left and the establishment right uncomfortable. And that's exactly where the truth lives. Stay sharp. I'll see you in the next one.